Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event. My name is Nadia Yala Kisukidi. I am an associate professor of Romance Studies at Duke and the director of the Center for French and Francophone Studies. I'm going to give a brief introduction before Professor Kisukidi's talk, and just a few words of organization. Well, you're all muted right now, but there will be opportunity to ask questions later on. Following Yala Kisukidi's talks, we will take responses from my colleague Felwin Sarr, who is Distinguished Professor of Romance Studies at Duke, and Romance Studies graduate students Anna Tibinko and Nazanin Rosado, and then questions from the audience. You can also use the chat feature to send your question after the talk. And please note that this event at Professor Kisukidi's request is not to be recorded. So please do not take snapshots, do not photograph the screens, please. Before we start, I would also like to remind everyone that this online event, like all events organized by the Center, are only made possible thanks to institutional support, including funding from the Cultural Services of the French Embassy and the Office of the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Duke. And it's a great honor to be welcoming Professor Yala Kisukidi today for our online transatlantic series on inequity and its contemporary forms. Nadia Yala Kisukidi is currently an associate professor of philosophy at Paris VIII Vincennes-Saint-Denis University and an adjunct director of the research center Les Logiques Contemporaines de la Philosophie. She was vice president of the Collège International de Philosophie from 2014 and 2016 and a member of the Critical Time editorial committee at Duke University. She has a strong interest in contemporary art and is now a co-curator of the Yango Biennale in Kinshasa. And through her role as curator, she has developed the notion of Laetitia Africana in resistance to the overwhelming melancholy that she has identified within postcolonial studies. Kisukidi specializes in French and African philosophies, more specifically on Bergson and the negritude movement. And I think it's in fact quite fascinating how she's been moving around those different traditions and worlds. Since becoming a professor, she has taught in Switzerland and France and has contributed to the creation of a global thought research network between Haiti, France, and Colombia. She has also published many books, collective or individual, among which Bergson ou l'humanité créatrice, Bergson or Creative Humanity in 2013. I got to know Yala Kisukidi's work through a letter to Europe, from which I would like to quote a short excerpt as a preamble to this talk. Dear Europe, we would like to say that you are dead. This is an idle idea. We must be more serious. You are not dead for, as an ideal, you are yet to come into being. Suzanne Sontag finally wrote in 1995 that Bosnia is your voluntary abortion. Like her, I believe that there are two Europes, the Europe that you embody, in which I live and that fails to fulfill, pushing away its wall, its borders towards Africa, and the second Europe, which is constantly being postponed, only existed on the hypothetical mode of what is yet to come. In between them, what remains, the intimate ferocity of the political fight. I think this is a very good way to start a conversation today. Please join me in welcoming Nadia Yala Kisukidi at the Center for French and Francophone Studies at Duke University for a timely and necessary talk on race and hospitality, investigating the complexity and paradoxes inherent in a French use of the notion of race.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. Yes, it's fine. I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank you, Anne-Gaëlle, for this invitation. And I don't know if Felwin, who is also a friend, was part of it, but I'm very happy to be here and to talk about this subject. We had this little conversation just before beginning about the language. So I will speak in English, and I will be very happy to speak and to use this language. But the question of the language is quite important because those subjects are very hard in French. And this lecture, there are several versions of this text. So now this is the last one, but I already tried to do a lecture about this subject in France. And I was targeted by a newspaper after that, and targeted as, we have those words now that are quite becoming hysterical, but I was targeted as a racialist, crazy. We have indigenist, we say that. I don't know if you say that in English.
But I think many people here who are following the conversation will understand.
Okay, so I was targeted by a newspaper. I won't tell you the name of the newspaper, but you all know it. And it was very horrible because they had completely fantasized what I had said during this lecture. And it just shows how it is very difficult just to pronounce some nouns. And when you say, for example, the word race, even if you explain the way you use it, sometimes, especially if you are a Black or an Arab scholar, you can be targeted publicly by newspaper or sometimes by your colleagues. So that's why I think it's interesting, and I will be very happy to have a discussion with you at the end of this lecture. What's more, and this will be my last words before beginning, this is a kind of meditation. So methodologically, it's a mix between, I would say, literature and philosophy. So it's a kind of a hybrid text, and I hope you will have a good conversation after that, and that you will enjoy it a little. So thank you very much. So the name of this lecture is called Race and Hospitality. And I want just to start with a quotation in French, and I don't know how to translate that in English, but anyway, let's try. It is a quotation from an Asian writer called Jean-Claude Charles, who wrote a book in French called Le Corps Noir. It was published by the great publishing home called Mémoire d'Encrier. And in this book, Jean-Claude Charles says, on n'en finirait pas d'établir la carte thanatographique de l'invention du corps noir. We will not finish by establishing the death mapping of the invention of the black body. I don't know if it's a good translation. Professor Angael, what do you think about my... It's okay? Thank you. So I would like to start with this quote. And with my first sentence, which is a very provocative sentence. Race dreams, or rather it stems from dreams which, one fixed within a politics, a jurisdiction, send the fantasy machine spinning again, on both sides. On the sides of those who support the production of the racial narrative as the ideological foundation of racism, on the side of the victims and targets of the racial narrative confronted with the violence of racism. Racism proliferates on desires of separation, of epuration. In a group which considers itself homogeneous, racialized subjects, construed as heterogeneous, are seen as threats to the moral and physical integrity of the social body. They must be driven away, deported. Against race, against racism, there is only one valid political aim: to defend a society without race, governed by the transcendental ethical and political principle of the universal. To build a society inclusive of all and capable of welcoming unconditionally, without regard for contingency, the first comer, he, she who presents him, herself on the threshold. But before going any further, let us take heed of a difficulty which stems from the specificity of racial violence, from its toxicity, and from the way it intoxicates. It presents us with a situation which can be difficult to understand. Against racism and racial terror, the proclamation of the universal does not always seem desirable. That is what I want to understand here. Why in the fight against racism, sometimes people cannot dream of the universal, but support and pursue in another mode dreams of race. Race does not exist, it is not biological, it is a social construct which sometimes extends its existence in the mode of dreams for those who have been harmed and destroyed by racism. It isn't sure whether all these dreams systematically carry visions of massacres, pogroms, and segregations. It isn't sure whether all these dreams make up an ontology. I wish to give a name to one of these dreams, racial hospitality. Racial hospitality as a dream of race made by those who are confronted to racism, systemic racism in their everyday life. And I will focus on anti-Black racism in this lecture. What is this dream? What is this provocative dream? What can this phrase and its seemingly ill-fitted terms, racial hospitality, refer to? Let's start in a very, postmodern way, in a very French way, with an author that is really important for me for this lecture. I will start with the question of hospitality. Hospitality, as you know, is the act of welcoming or housing somebody in one's home for free. A liberal, charitable, and amicable act. The person who is welcomed is a stranger to the household. Welcoming him or her means allowing them to settle in, whether definitely or temporarily, and supplying a space which they need. Hospitality is a necessity when the groups to which an individual belongs, family, clan, nation, present inadequacies and flaws which limit, diminish, or may even destroy personal life. Asking for hospitality and to be welcomed in a community other than your own can result from several reasons, more or less tragic and violent. The necessity of departure arises, the necessity of finding a shelter, a sanctuary, a place that is both safe and welcoming. Hospitality produces a lasting connection between the host and the individuals who, having left their community, rediscover the possibility of a commonality in the moment of their welcoming. Jacques Derrida draws a very important distinction between two understandings of hospitality. I want to repeat them here. On the one hand, in the mode of the pact, the contract. On the other hand, according to a principle of unconditionality. Rooted in mores, custom, objective morality or law, the right to hospitality commits a household, a line of descent, a family, a familial or ethnic group receiving a familial or ethnic group. I'm quoting Jacques Derrida and the conversation he had with Anne Dufourmentel. This right entails contracting parties, in other words, quoting, that it is possible for them to be called by their names, to have names, to be subject in laws, to be questioned and liable, to have crimes imputed to them, to be held responsible, to be equipped with nameable identities and proper names. End of the quote. The stranger, once recognized and identifiable, no longer appear as a threat and is allowed to come in so that exchanges and trade may resume. This right is granted to the stranger only insofar as he or she remains identifiable. The effective conditions of hospitality are hence limited, The anonymous newcomer, bearing no name, no longer the stranger but the absolute other, the barbarian, remains for his part on the threshold. Often, he or she is driven away, beaten up, or sent back to sea, barred from birthing. Welcoming this other demands to break with the pact of hospitality, to depart from the framework of the law. It entails another form of hospitality, which Jacques Derrida calls unconditional hospitality. Conditional hospitality, unconditional hospitality. The former limits and often forbids the latter. The latter requires the former in order to become politically effective. Such is the antinomy of hospitality, in Derrida's thinking, both a principle of inclusion and exclusion. Corrupted, gone off the rails, hospitality turns into hostility. Little connection with what here must be addressed, I know. But the antinomy of hospitality, Derrida creates a word called hostipitality, just to connect hostility and hospitality. So the antinomy of hospitality, hostipitality, allows us to grasp what is at stake in certain dreams of race made by those who are victims of racism. Racial hospitality. What does this expression mean? What can racial hospitality mean? This phrase doesn't ring a bell, or it just sounds wrong. It might even refer to some filthy trash. It immediately displays what its double condition will be, race and pact. A pact concluded within race, codifying racial national preferences implicitly or explicitly granted, justifying when required an unequal distribution of social and political rights. Racial hospitality, conditional hospitality, will then double in the form of a hazardous and little compelling phrase, the practices and the languages of oppression, relentlessly nurturing the death drive, the thirst for xenophobic attacks, razzias, extermination. But this expression, racial hospitality, can be read the other way around and understood very differently. A clear-cut question can be asked: how do we mobilize against racial oppression or racism? How do we ward off the fantasies of separation which materially and unconsciously structure society, suffusing its laws sometimes, expressed in the public space and in political speeches and displayed in individual or collective acts of violence? In liberal democracies, the law plays a protective role. It must be reformed and transformed when it fails to provide a framework guaranteeing support and assistance to individuals who have been wronged. It must be strengthened and its implementation ensured if it can help to fight against the racialization of the socio-political field. In both cases, the power of the law lies in the attention it shows to all subjects without exception. The imperative and universal dimensions of the law act as guarantees against racial oppression. The power of the state lies in the attention it shows to fragilized subjects. But what kind of protection are we speaking of? How can we and how should we understand the phrase, the law and the state protect? We must address all at once the status of law's verticality, the issue of the acknowledgement of the harm suffered, and the very notion of protection. The appeal to rights and law comes as a response to a demand for reparation when a subject has been wronged and has suffered harm. This appeal can arise out of many contexts in which the acknowledgement of harm is be more or less easy. In the case of racism, one must provide proof of the oppression and discrimination, bringing forward witnesses, evidence, and undeniable signs. But the violence of racism comes precisely from the fact that racialized subjects are not recognized as subjects bearing the truth. Epistemic injustice tied to racism draw a circle which entraps racialized subjects in the mental structures of a paranoid type. Exaggeration, aberration, delusion. We know the arguments of the touchiness of Black people, for instance, and all of the others, these professionals of victimization. But whether a subject who is victim of racism is believed or not, whether law is enforced or not, what remains? Law protects, yes, but it does not necessarily heal the wounded subject, and it does not erase the existence of racism in societies. Here occurs the inevitable shift from the judicial legal problematic to the clinical issues of healing, sickness, and health. Or to put it in more adequate terms, which is to say, in vitalistic terms, how can one increase one's great health, to quote Nietzsche? How can one fortify the forces of life within oneself, life-creating forces, when race diminishes, belittles, and sings of death? Confronted with the racist machine, the psyche is blown and goes off the rail. It must be assuaged, repaired, all that the law cannot, all that the state cannot. Who can repair? Where do the subjects confronted to racism find the peace they need to reconstruct themselves, even in a political way? In societies where racialized subjects confronted to structuring racism, often unaware of itself, are a minority, those racialized subjects are a minority, the everyday life experience is permeated with race. For example, in France, the attack against the presence of post-colonial studies in the universities that started violently in 2018 with petition in newspaper targets usually Black and Arab scholars. Race overflows, content with itself, and scrambles what is, after all, nothing but a conventional border between reality and fantasy. Racial hospitality then appears as another way, both immediate and figured, dreamt, non-juridical, to heal oneself, to take shelter from a social and political violence which breaks bodies, corrupts understanding, and alters judgment. This hospitality is a dream of race, but it is a minor dream. It does not establish power, implement laws, or extend the fascistic and morbid deliriums of majorities. No institution supports it, promotes it, or claims it. It is at the basis of many infra-political desires which take hold of racialized subjects confronted with the shortcomings of the collective. To the shortcomings of the collective, of the clan, the village, the nation, the state, which brutalizes and does not protect, responds a desire for hospitality rooted in the principle of race. This is one of the difficulties of the fight against racism, this tension between two understandings of race, as a dominant technology of hate that must be condemned, and as a minor desire for a shelter by those who are destroyed by this technology. The desire for a shelter provided by a sturdy community, a community under the veil, to quote Du Bois, a community of beliefs, a community of skin. This skin becomes a sign, it becomes a rallying cry. That which overexposes to violence now signals a way to a shelter. The shelter is the space where de facto and de jure, the place of the newcomer is not contested, where the wounds of oppression, of racism, are acknowledged, may heal and be mended. Racial hospitality is hence this infra-political, in the sense of James Scott, and thaumaturgical dream of the immediate creation of a shelter when confronted with the sufferance of racism. It comes prior to any political will and precedes, giving them foundation, desires of community, of people, of solidarity, or even of nation. These desires are not parallel or symmetrical. They do not mutually imply each other, and they entail political aims and orientations which are sometimes, if not often, conflicting. Inferred from the reality of racial oppression, a welcoming place starts to appear, a place of protection, of rest, of reconstitution of the self, paradoxically provided by race. At the heart of this dream lies the figure of the stranger. Racial hospitality is not another deception. Individuals who are strangers to one another do not magically become identical under the sheer insulting category that pinpoints them and oppresses them. They recognize each other as victims of the same violence and provide each other with mutual assistance. In this dream of race, hospitality actualizes a turnaround. We witness the reversal of hostility into hospitality. The hostis, race, by becoming host, becomes hospitable almost naturally. I will give an example so it will be more clear. This dream of racial hospitality remains toxic and corrupted. The meanings of the signifier race waver. The risk that the racial signifier morph into an ontology, that which did not exist as a result of the productivist derailment which gave birth to the slave trader, the Middle Passage, the plantation, takes shape and becomes naturalized. The dream of racial hospitality exposes the antinomy on which it relies. Even if it remains irreducible to the regime of the nomos, of the law, hospitality depends on one condition. Here, the racial stigma is a condition of hospitality for those who are targeted by racism. But the strict specification of this condition is delirious. In establishing itself, it undermines itself and implodes. The racial delirium is a classificatory one. Under the racial construct of the, we say that in French, I will say it in French because I know the word is very complicated, but le nègre, so I won't say it in English. Under the racial construct of le nègre, for instance, proliferate all the rambling notions of the racialist taxonomy as they are used in the plantation and in the colonial project. The nègre is distinguished from the mulatto or from other forms of hybridity, which help to challenge the university of the category black and to increase the ambivalence of its effect with regards to power in the political and social field. Light-skinned black, dark-skinned blacks, blacks that are totally white, real blacks, false blacks. In and of itself, hospitality destroys any desire to authenticate. The shelter protects from the classificatory derailments of racism, which mark the skin and stigmatize vile bodies. The black man or woman who opens the door does not differentiate between blacks, but instead recognizes the stranger before him or her as the victim of the same racial violence and invites that stranger to cross the threshold. To identify is not to authenticate. Racial hospitality presumes the identification of a shared oppression, but does not produce in return subjects of truth. The stranger does not arrive bare and nameless. He or she bears the stigma of race, which conditions their welcoming in. But in crossing the threshold, in entering the shelter, race is abolished. There are no more nègres, no more mulattoes, no more chabins, no more quadroons, no beasts or monsters. Such is the aporia of this dream of hospitality, the inclusive disjunction it carries with it and cannot solve. Racial hospitality calls both for the positive acknowledgement of the stigma of race and for the necessity of its radical negation. Racial hospitality does not humiliate the universal, it acknowledges it, but claims it only in second stance, and even then, not in the form of a resolution. Far removed from the flesh and from bodies, the universal is unhospitable and deepens the solitudes of those who suffer by laying down as its principle the necessity of their anonymity. It defends, and justly so, the salutary exclusivity of disjunction, race or its negation, but not both. Supremely mobilized, however, it is of no assistance and offers no shelter. Hospitality does not address anonymized subjects. It answers to a specific and well-identified need. In acknowledging the sufferance caused by racism, the aim is first and foremost to restore the possibility of being welcomed by a group before which one is not forced to bring up reasons to justify oneself, to blend in, to fade away. How may we understand this racial hospitality in a concrete way without saying too many stupidities? I'm sorry if I say too many stupidities. How may we cross those poisoned waters? We can perhaps take a look at a literary geography of escapes, at the attempts to leave racial terror behind which lie at the core of certain African-American writings torn between two cities, Paris and New York. One can pass through Manhattan and Harlem and cross the Atlantic Ocean before arriving in Paris, then go back in the other direction, or why not, make a long stopover in Europe before returning to Africa. These travels, these back and forth trips, may be found in the writings of James Baldwin, Richard Wright, Chester Himes, Ta-Nehisi Coates, of artists, jazzmen, and who all preferred the European world to that of America, even in the 21st century. One issue comes up: can we imagine how these writings are read on the other side of the Atlantic? How are they received by Black people across the ocean, by those who live in Europe, by those who live in France, by those like me who live in Paris? In James Baldwin's novel, This Morning, This Evening, So Soon, taken from the collection Going to Meet the Man, a Black jazz singer living in Paris, married to a white French woman called Harriet, and father of a little boy named Paul, is gripped by anxiety. The idea of returning to the US to give a concert pains him. He has spent too many years away from a country viewed as a source of repulsion. Here are his thoughts. I'm quoting the jazzman. I think how, if I had never left America, I would never have met her, Harriet, and would never have entered my own life. For everyone's life begins on a level where races, armies, and churches stop. And yet, everyone's life is always shaped by races, churches, and armies. Races, churches, armies menace and have taken many lives. If Harriet had been born in America, it would have taken her a long time, perhaps forever, to look on me as a man like other men. If I had met her in America, I would never have been able to look on her as a woman like all other women. The habits of public rage and power would also have been our private compulsions and would have blinded our eyes. We will never have been able to love each other. The shelter here is the material and existential condition to building a life of one's own. In Baldwin's novel, the shelter is the place where the very possibility of dream of race as racial hospitality vanishes. In the shelter, there are no police arrests, no racial discriminations, because race does not appear as a structure of domination inherent to the modes of organization of administrations, police, law, and society in general. Paris emerges as a shelter through the voice of the jazzman in This Morning, This Evening, So Soon. In Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, published 50 years later in 2015, Paris is also described as a shelter. According to Coates, people in the US, I quote him, believe in the reality of race as a defined, undebatable feature of the natural world, end of the quote. But Paris provides something else. Here is quote writing to his son. We came back to Paris that summer because your mother loved the city and because I loved the language, but above all, because of you. I wanted you to have your own life, apart from fear, even apart from me. I am wounded. I am marked by old codes which shielded me in one word and then chained me in the next. To have your own life. Paris opens its arms and welcomes the Black bodies destroyed and harmed by Uncle Sam. Even New York, the city where something different awaits around every corner, says Ta-Nehisi Coates. Even New York does not let anyone forget that Black skin remains a target. Paris is a shelter, a social space that is not structurally organized by race, a social space where it is possible to escape from race, a social space where the hallucinated dream of racial hospitality is not needed at all. The mythology of Paris as a city of Black talents and tolerance, symbol of a France depicted as a land of freedom, has been exposed in African-American writings since the 19th century. These writings do not erase the colonial question, of course, especially the anti-Arab racism unabashedly displayed during the Algerian War. But they still describe France as a liberal nation where talent is just, regardless of race and skin color. Paris is a heterotopia, in the words of Foucault, a space that is over but also real, a space of perfection that welcomes the undesirable, I cannot say this word, undesirable bodies rejected by the white American world. It highlights a new deracialized urban cartography, breaking with spaces in which race is the dominant structure of the social order. In the white American world, the times of history swing like a pendulum. Their movements underline a perverse intertwining of ruptures and repetitions. The end of slavery, the beginning of Jim Crow. The end of Jim Crow is connected to the mass incarceration of Black male bodies. The election of the first Black presidents echoes the call Black Lives Matter against the systemic assassination of Black bodies by the police. But the mythology surrounding Paris must be questioned. How is it perceived? These short excerpts of from Baldwin and Coates produce a singular feeling of incongruity for French Black people. Edouard Glissant, for example, recalls the shock experienced by fresh West Indian immigrants in the 50s upon their arrival in mainland France, in Paris. I could quote Glissant in French because it's very hard to translate Glissant. And I will try to make the worst translation of Glissant. And I hope you won't be, you will be nice with me. So it's about the West Indies arriving in France, in Paris, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Il se sent français, mais il subit des formes latentes ou déclarées de racisme, tout comme un arabe ou un portugais. Un des grands chocs ressentis par les Antillais en France aura été de se voir confondus dans les rues des villes avec les Algériens au temps de la guerre d'Algérie. It is a quote from le discours antillais, and it says, so the West Indian feels that it is French, but he's subjected to forms of racism as Arab people or Portuguese. One of the big shocks felt by the West Indies in France is to be, how do you say that? I'm losing my English. To be être confondu.
To be mistaken as
yeah.
Be
mistaken.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. So they are mistaken as Algerians in the cities, in the streets of Paris. So West Indian immigrants, French citizens, are mixed up with the worst Africans of all time, those who have taken up arms against the empire, Algerians. This is the quote of Glissant. This is how the image of the West Indian immigrant is reflected in the mirror of French cities, of Paris. The impossible belonging, the impossible citizenship, even when administrative papers attest to their French citizenship. Paris becomes this empty space where the sluggish story of the universal is frantically told. The sites of the memory of the working class, of anti-colonial and post-colonial memories are erased by the tranquility of the bourgeois consciousness. We may hence assume that Paris does not embody the idea of a shelter in the imaginaries of the writings of non-white and Black people in France, as can be shown by the writings of some Black French women of today, I would say Assa Traoré, Rokhaya Diallo, or even Maboula Soumaoro. We may also assume that the erasure of race at the core of discourses promoting the rhetoric of the universal produces an abundance of dreams of race in the minds of racialized subjects. Against the false indifference of the universal, the desire to protect oneself arises when society has decided to close its eyes. This is the moment where we are living now, but this was also underlined by the thinkers of the negritude themselves. What the discourse of the universal erases is the reality of racism, which hasn't ceased to increase, despite the strong assertions of the law of the Constitution, repeating to anyone willing to believe it that there is no racial discrimination on this side of this ocean. First article of the Constitution of the French Fifth Republic. Égalité des citoyens devant la loi sans distinction d'origine, de race et de sexe. Equality of all citizens before the law without distinction of origin, race, and religion. This article was modified in July 2018 as follows, without distinction of sex, origin, or religion. Race vanishes from the Constitution because race does not exist. And it's true, it does not exist. But a majority may well want what the law does not and which it punishes. This majority can also use the universality of the law as an excuse to incriminate people while pretending to defend them at the same time. Wanting without wanting, wanting without knowing. The social body is sometimes oblivious and conscious. As confident as it may be about its principles, a republic can be supported by a majority adhering to an unconscious belief in the existence of race, even when this majority subjectively identifies to the values of the republic. The proclamation of the universal as an ideal and a standard of law does not abolish the racial unconscious that expands secretly throughout the society, its policies of redistribution, the organization of its powers, the way its institutions are embodied or personified. Police brutality, racial profiling, discriminations, employment, housing, territory, never-ending debates on colonial, post-colonial legacies, on identity, on our ancestors, the Gauls, on the color of France, and most of all, on the Vera Christiana Religio. All these practices and discourses are the signs of a resurgence of a repressed unconscious. In Between the World and Me, Paris is depicted as a transparent city, a city devoid of any unconscious, a city without unconsciousness. But the city of light hides a long history of violence whose multiple figures are expressed through slavery and many other. The dream of racial hospitality becomes clear. It arises and reinforces itself through this long French history of race. In words that pride themselves on the proclamation of the universal, the minor desire of race as a shelter can be substituted to the major ideology of race as a structure. Though it may be a stretch of the imagination, it is possible to wish for race and to run from it for the same reason, in the name of a real life, unaffected by the violence of the racial oppression. Such is the paradox in which racialized people are trapped when they fight against racism. Such is the aporia of the fight against racism, and perhaps the aporia of la noirceur, French blackness in itself. So there is, to conclude, a singular dream in countries where the word universal becomes a fetish. Fetish in the anthropological sense, that is to say, the word universal becomes an object of superstition to which we attribute magic powers of pacification, or fetish as a psychoanalytic sense, the word universal is used as a medium for phallic excitement to sublimate the hate and the resentment of the dominants so they may feel good about themselves. In countries where the term universal functions as a fetish, the bodies that are in excess, racialized bodies, build impossible dreams. The dream of racial hospitality is one of them, infra-political belief, which drifts and settles in the ideas of community, people, nation, or solidarity, many different political meanings that deal differently with the word race by abolishing it radically or by maintaining its toxicity. Those who are racially offended remain strangers to each other, sometimes even hating each other and reproducing among themselves forms of dominations they wish to escape. But behind every racial insult and offending behavior, within every society is rooted in racism, a toxic dream sneaks in, both comforting and difficult. Race can become an effective sign pointing to a hospitable space which welcomes those who have been harmed by racism. This is the end.
Thank you so much. I think I'm just going to pass on the, I think it's just for Felwine and Anna Nazanin to respond to you right now, but I think it was a really necessary talk as well, because everything you've been mentioning or exploring about the aporia, the contradictions, the paradoxes is so acute right now in France. And we're both in Paris, so we kind of feel it on a daily basis. So I really think that was a very important talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anna Nazanin, do you want to start and maybe end with Felwine? I think maybe that, how would you, yeah? Who would like to start?
I can start if you want.
Okay, you can start.
Okay, thank you, Angel, and thank you, Yala, for this amazing talk. Yala is a very brilliant philosopher, and I think in this talk she raised an important question, the question of racism that we are experiencing both in the transatlantic space. And this question became this last month a very crucial one. You experience here in the US all the issue raised by the George Floyd murder, and also in France all the demonstration against Assa Traoré's brother's crime, and all the questions that are actually France is dealing with. And Yala, you raise an important question: how do we mobilize against racial oppression, and how do we work against the fantasy of separation? And in your talk, you point out the limits of law as a legal framework to respond, particularly according to the idea of repairing, healing. And your proposition is, so you name it, an infra-political proposition of a space that you call the racial hospitality space, a space of shelter, desire of community, etc., etc. At the same time, you raise in France this colorblindness or the denial of racism, sometimes shelter under the idea of universalism, and universalism becoming a fetish that don't acknowledge the reality of race experience, in people, communities, and bodies. So one of the questions that I want to raise is around the idea of how you link hospitality and race, around the idea of racial hospitality. But I just want to focus on the idea of hospitality. Most of the time, hospitality is seen as a practical principle that consists in welcoming the one who comes, and the one is most of the time called the stranger or the foreigner, and there is in hospitality this idea of a temporary renunciation of a part of your world, of one's world, or your resources or your space to host someone, And hospitality can be seen as a moral obligation most of the time, a social one, embedded in social and cultures, a cultural or sometimes a political issue. And one of the questions in hospitality is the question of the identity of the person we welcome. Is it an outsider, an alien, a foreigner, to my language, to my society, etc., etc. And here, this person is the one who is victim of racism and whose difference is reified. So the race is the reified difference. And the question I ask is, the host is defined by the relation called hospitality. And one became a host through the relation instituted by the hospitality. And how do you deal here with the idea that the identification of the one that is host is the reified race? I don't know if I'm clear here. Is
very clear.
Yes. How do you deal with that? And the question that came from listening your talk is that how can we deal with the idea of that ethical principle that embodied individual hospitality are most of the time non-sufficient when the racism is structural, when the racism is in the collective unconscious, is sometimes in laws, sometimes on a long history of practice. So how do you think that a space, a shelter that is built by people, communities, and a non-political shelter, a non-legal one, can deal with these structures that are embedded in the society? This is the one question probably I will let you move on this one and add a second later.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ferry, for your lecture. To be very clear, I have perhaps to explain how this idea of racial hospitality came. It came when I lived in New York, 4 years ago, and I experienced something in the US, which could be very horrible, but that was marvelous for me, is that I think my skin color designed people to me who were already people who would be able to protect me. So it was very easy just to embrace my skin in the US, even if we already had all those problems of police brutality. The movement Black Lives Matter at that moment was very important already. And I remember it was just before Donald Trump was elected. And I remember on the TV, you always had all the histories you had on the TV, all the stories you had on the TV were completely, became completely different when the factor of race was engaged in them. For example, I remember the story of an accident in a zoo where a mother just had his son, where the son, a little boy fell down in the cage of the gorillas, and the gorillas had to be killed because we had to protect the little boy. And everybody said that it was a good thing that the gorilla was killed by the people working in the zoo. But 2 days after, when people learned that the little boy was a Black boy, the story became totally different. And the question was, what did the mother do? Who is the mother? Is she taking drugs? Is she a good mother? We have to condemn the mother because the life of this gorilla is very important. We shouldn't have killed the gorilla. And after you had big campaigns, even on the social networks, to save the life of the gorilla, and big demonstrations, on the social networks in front of the zoo for this gorilla. So race here just become a hermeneutical key to transform the way we are confronted to reality and how our reason is completely destroyed by this toxic notion. And what was so strange is that in this country, in the US, where I was confronted to the absolute toxicity of race, and at the same time, I was experiencing the fact that my Black skin was also recognized as a sign, as a rallying sign for other people. And it was very disturbing. I mean, to be in these two, how can I say that? It was disturbing to experience those two expressions of race. And it was more disturbing because in France, when you want to express something about your Blackness, not even in a narcissistic way, but just to write on it, to think about it, you are already targeted as a person who doesn't want to be part of the society and who want to separate from the society. So that's why this lecture wanted to understand those two experiences. And I know that the question of hospitality is important because it's really a dream. It has nothing to do with a political structure. It's just the dream that, in fact, when you see a Black person, you already imagine that this person is with you, belongs to the same group as you, and that you all together will be a force against the destructive powers that want to sometimes kill you. And that's just a dream, because after, and that's why the tension that I like with Derrida, hospitality, it was interesting to play with it, because it is, I wanted to understand how the most toxic elements of political life, race, can become a host, a kind of shelter that is able at the end to build or to nurture political aims against racism and nurture Black communities or even other political structures or desires. But it's something more singular. It's more some things like meditation, and it's just the very simple desire we express when we just say that when you are a victim of a violence, you expect that all the victims of the same violence will understand you without words, without any justification, and that you will be part of the same group. But we all know it's not possible. And that's why I call it a dream. And there is a second thing that I want to say, and that's why I say that this idea that seems comfortable remains toxic, is that, for example, when, as I said it in the lecture, race is a classificatory principle. And when you have race, you have also colorism, you have Black people that are lighter than the others and things like that. And I think that in the way sometimes the Black community, even in France, reconnect or rebuild itself, you still have this toxicity of the classificatory principle of race that is sometimes undermining the way people are gathering themselves. And you still can find sometimes in Black communities, some people that are targeted because they are lighter and because they are not real Blacks and that they don't belong. That's why I want to keep this idea of toxicity. And that's why I want to keep the idea that this is also in the minor mode, this is also a kind of hospitality that can be the most beautiful way to be engaged politically in the social space, but it remains toxic all the time. And I think that all the movement that we have to face when we fight against racism by rebuilding a kind of Black identity, political Black identity, remains very difficult. I don't know if I was clear.
Very clear.
And the second question it's an important one, because I don't know if I am clear when I say this idea, but it's really a dream. It's really abstract, and it can nurture after. Community is not a dream. The community exists and it defines itself, and it has I don't know, rules or things like that. Nation too, people too. We can invent them, of course, but they are, I mean, concrete and real. This dream of racial hospitality is not physical, is not concrete. It's just the dream you have that race can still be the way you can condemn what you are facing, that is to say racism. Just to be clearer, in the first text of the people like Léopold Sédar Senghor or even Césaire in the 30s, when they talked about negritude, they didn't talk about community, they didn't talk about people, they didn't talk about, I don't know, nation or black nation. I mean, Césaire and Senghor are not black nationalists, do not belong to the trend of black nationalism. But what they were saying is that we can, I don't know, against what we are facing in Europe and especially in France, we can imagine that our skin is a rallying sign, and that perhaps we can fulfill or nurture our way to connect with each other just by recognizing the way that this skin shows us a shared experience. And this shared experience says that we don't have to explain what we are facing, we don't have to explain what we are going through. And this is how this idea of a shelter takes shape, I think.
Angel, should I move to my second question or later? Probably.
I think maybe later, just to give the opportunity to Anna and Nazanin to ask their own questions. And then, yeah, we can continue the conversation. And I just would like to remind the participants that they can send their question in the chat, which I will moderate as well, if they have specific questions for Yala Kisukidi. Anna or Nazanin, Nazanin, you want to start? Yeah.
Sure. Of course. First, thank you as always for your excellent and thought-provoking words and for being here with us today. My first question is, to simply put, can we make a distinction between racial hospitality as this somewhat impractical infra-political structure, which is incapable of structurally addressing racism, and in a second state as what you've called a dream? Because I recognized in your words this reoccurring theme in lots of Black and Afro-Caribbean literature of Paris and also Africa more largely as a utopic shelter that could be returned to, where one could be welcomed with open arms, which is of course an impractical and often unrealistic dream if it is brought into reality in that way. But as you said towards the beginning of your talk, law and the political structures that we have today fail to heal the traumatic psychic wounds of structuralized racism. And I am wondering if this appeal to what you've called racial hospitality, this trope of being welcomed on the basis of that which marks you as other, if it serves a epistemic or epistemological purpose other than addressing structural racism, if it is a manner of imagining a utopia, and if in the act of that imagination there isn't some amount of healing that takes place on a psychic level. And to quote you from Leticia Africana, on page 56, I realize that this is in French, but I guess I'll try to sum up afterwards. You cite Mignolo and you say, décoloniser le savoir, c'est inventer des autres formes de vie du savoir qui ne prolifèrent pas sur la différence coloniale et y mettent un terme. Tel est le sens de la désobéissance épistémique. I quickly put in English, here you talk about decolonizing knowledge as a way of, or rather inventing other forms of life and of knowledge that are not common now, or that are not dependent on the idea of a colonial difference in order to decolonize knowledge. And I realized that the idea of racial hospitality does exactly that. It does proliferate on the idea of the colonial difference, but it does seem to me also a possible form of epistemological disobedience. And I will wrap up with just this other thought, which is that in the ideas of Derrida that you summed up so brilliantly, you made it quite clear that in the traditional knowledge forms of hospitality, the one who is welcomed is other in relation to the host.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if what changes in this idea or this dream of racial hospitality is that there's a shared experience, a shared lived experience between the host and the one who comes. And if that doesn't in some ways deconstruct or decolonize the contractual relationship that has been imagined in more traditional ideas of hospitality. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't, to be more precise about this idea, the racial hospitality has no epistemic dimension. It is just what I really want to understand is, for example, I think that the argument that says that the recognition of our universal humanity is perfect to fight against race. And my question is, why doesn't it work? Why? I mean, it would be very, very simple. Everybody now is just, I don't know, talking about that color blindness is really for the conservative people, and that when you want to, I don't know, speak with the idea of the universalism, you are conservative. But I think it's quite crazy to be considered as a conservative because you use the term of the universal. And it's true that if you want to fight against racism, you have to erase racism, so you have to erase the race, or the simple idea that race can be used as a tool to free yourself. It's quite absolutely absurd and absolutely difficult. And this is what this type of difficulties, this conception of racial hospitality wants to deal with. Why do we, when we have a beautiful I don't know, beautiful principle of universalism, of inclusive democracy, why do we still dream and need those type of concepts that are destroying ourselves? And why do we think that these concepts can be useful for the political fight, but also for our own personal lives? And this is what this idea of racial hospitality means. And I think I have two concrete examples. For example, in France, you have a lot of, it's in every communities, but in France, let's talk about the Black French communities. You have a lot of groups that are now gathering themselves under the sign of race. Here, this is a non-mixed group of Black women, or this is a non-mixed group of, I don't know, Black people. So we are sure that if we are all between us as a Black person, we will be able just to reinforce themselves, to talk about our experience, and to construct space that are not utopian, but that are real, to reconstruct our own subjectivities that are wounded. And I think that if you believe that this kind of non-mixed groups are possible, it is that they are fulfilled by this dream of racial hospitality. You think that by being being part of those groups won't be will be a moment where you can just have a rest and be able to fulfill all the virtualities and the beauties of your own personal life. But I think that if people think this way, if they want to create this kind of non-mixed group, I don't know if you say non-mixed in English, I said it in French, non-mixed, do we say that?
I'm not sure. I think you will have to ask some native English speaker, because that's for me, it's always hard to be navigating the two worlds in terms of those conversations regarding race, because in France, on emploierait l'idée même presque d'exclusion en fait. Donc, so I think non-mix could work, but maybe there is a more precise term that would translate. I'm not sure.
I mean, non-mixity, and I think that, for example, the non-mixity, you can say that it is bad, you can say that it is good. It's not my purpose here. But this way to organize is rooted in the idea that race can become a shelter, and that the people who are facing the same expressions of violence and racism are bound together. And this is what I want to say. And what is interesting is that when you have this dream of racial hospitality, when it becomes concrete, when you effectively create your non-mixed group, when you effectively create your party or your association, you see that when you have created a kind of a physical group, that this group, even if you believe that because we are all among each other and we are the same person, that we won't have to leave the violence of racism, you see that even in those groups, the toxicity of race is still active. And this is what I wanted to say. That's why I wanted to start with Jacques Derrida and his idea of hospitality. Here you have a kind of turnover. I mean, the enemy hostis became the host that still remains hostis. I don't know if it's clear. It can become, it's really not abstract. I can give you an example. It's a very, when I was, okay, it's a personal example, but it's related to this. If I am in the US, I am considered as a mixed race person. My mother is white, my father is black. When I am in France, I am not considered as a mixed race person. I am just considered as a black person. But what was interesting is that when I was a teenager, I was very politically committed and committed in Black movements and in the Back to Africa movements. It was at the beginning of the 21st centuries, yes, in the 20,000s. And I belonged to a group that was perhaps, I would say, a kind of a French translation of Afrocentric group you can find here in the US, but it was quite different because there were more people coming from Africa, and in the US it's more people from America. And this group said that we are all black, so we are here all together. We are not racist, but we are here constructing or building a group where only black people can be accepted. Because here we must be able to talk about what we are facing in this country without feeling censored, and without having to justify ourselves a long time. We have to be able to express what we feel. So this is a kind of concrete traduction of racial hospitality. A group is creating themselves under the shelter, the idea that race, the blackness, is a shelter. But what was interesting is that after you have, I mean, the principle of the classificatory toxicity of race was always reappearing in this group. It started with the religion. If you are a real Black, you cannot be Christian, you cannot be Muslim, you cannot be Jew. You have to have a real religion that is rooted in African traditions. But that is a problem. There are African Jews, there are, I mean, Black African Jews, there are Black African Muslims, there are Black African Christians. So what was the criterion that was used to be able to reconnect our Blackness? Because when we were always trying to identify and to give a definition to this Blackness, you still had the toxicity of the classificatory principle of race re-emerging. Or can a mixed race be recognized? I mean, the mulatto I was talking to in my paper, can the mulatto be considered as a real Black? Is the mulatto not a traitor that will, at the end, undermine the reality and the solidity of the group? So you still have the toxicity of the classificatory principle that is undermining the hospitality that you thought you could find in the idea of race as a shelter. But at the same time, you need this idea of race as a shelter to find ways to reconstruct your own life and to find ways to express yourself and to be able to fight against racism. And this is the aporia of the fight against racism from the point of view of the minorities, if I can say that. And I want to keep this aporia. That is to say that, I don't know if it was what you were meaning, Nassanine, but in this, in many, for example, decolonial writings, very important and very good, we have to erase the idea of race and even of Blackness, because it is an expression of the colonial difference. And as we all know, Black were invented by the people who believed that they were existing as Black people, I mean, the white people. So if we really want to, I don't know, to emancipate ourselves, we should erase Blackness. But it's not possible. And this is the aporia of the fight against racism, is that at the same time, you need to erase race and to reinforce it to find a shelter. That's why it's impossible, I think, to erase the question of Blackness. And what's more is that Blackness in itself is not only the skin, it's also now a mass of documents, of writings, of texts. It's an archive. It's an archive. It's an archive of beautiful writings, and you can even be confronted to the idea of Blackness without being injured by racism. So now it has become a kind of tradition that has a long history that says that I will never say that we have to erase Blackness, even if I can be, and even if I recognize that I am still very attached to some principles that we have found in emancipatory practices like universalism. And I think it's easy to say that when you fight against racism, you have to get rid of race. And I think it's not possible to destroy this idea. But it's also not possible to destroy the idea that you need to put or to give strength and solidity to the idea of Blackness, because we need it as a tool to fight against racism and as a tool to reconstruct our own life. And it's not an ontology, I think. And I don't know if, sometimes when I speak in English, it's not very clear. It's clearer when I speak in French. So I hope I am not too confused, really, because sometimes I go from an idea to another one. So don't hesitate to tell me. But I want to say that what is interesting with the idea of perhaps those idea of racial hospitality and the way they connect to the idea of blackness, I call it noirceur in French, is that we are still living in an aporia. And I think that what we cannot erase is the fact that the fight against racism remains into this aporia. It's not an easy fight between the horrible racist and white supremacist, in the case we are talking about here, and on the other side, the clear universalists who don't see anything about race and who see all the human, everybody. It's not as simple. And racial hospitality is a way to explain that it is not as simple, because when you have racism, the people who are victims of racism are imagining or inventing ways to protect themselves and to fight against violence that reconnect sometimes with the idea of race. I hope I was clear, Nazanin, because I had the impression to be like...
No, yes, you're very clear. Thank you very much for your response.
We say to drown, to drown in deep waters. No, it's not to drown.
Certainly. No, thank you, Professor Kisukidi, because I think that helps clarify some of the questions I had as well. First of all, just thank you for this really beautiful, I like at the beginning you framed this as a meditation, and I really appreciate exactly that, right? These reflections on the tensions within this possibility or sort of impossibility of hospitality, right? Of racial hospitality. And I think you were touching on it just now, so it's sort of perfect that I'm going last, but I would love for you to just return and speak a bit more about another set of tensions, which are the tensions you posed at the beginning, right? Like this one tool we have may be to defend society itself without race, and at the same time, the proclamation of the universal has been known to cause its own destruction, right? We're living right this minute, this sort of horrible about face of several decades of claims of a post-racial Europe, right? And I really think that that roots a lot of the populism that we're seeing now, this turn in many different countries, relates back to these post-racial claims, right? And just the damage of the post, that it's some sort of breaking with the past, and once you proclaim it, it exists, you know, and that the past is erased or hidden. And I think I want to sort of get at that by going back to, I was really interested, both of your examples of Paris as a shelter, right? In the work of Baldwin, in the work of Coates. With Coates in particular, I'm not sure if I read it differently or if we in fact read it the same, but I think precisely his sensation of this sort of safe place for his son in Paris comes from the fact that race and racism are not universal, that they are particular, that they are local. I saw the same in your examples, and I'm thinking of Coates's own, in the same text, right? Coates's own declaration, race is the child of racism, not the father, right? I would only modify that with race is the child of racism. So I think in there, I see a lot of potential for your proposition of hospitality and also the frustrations of it in that familial metaphor, right? This connection between hospitality and the family, which of course is somewhat dangerous around race when we, you know, the risk of somehow reconnecting to the biological I think that I just would be very interested to hear a bit more if, can those who identify with race to fight racism act as branches in the same family? Is there solidarity there? Is that, I mean, I think that's very much what you were getting at. But above all, I would love to hear more about the potential and the frustrations of the universal, because I think we're in a key moment for struggling with that concept.
Yeah, it's true. I was thinking when you were talking that I think I used the word hospitality because I don't want to use the word ontology, and I don't want to do a kind of a ontology of Blackness, because when you do this type of ontology, you are not able to see the difficulties and the toxicity that remains in the term Blackness itself. I really want, to me, perhaps that the experiences of being mixed race in places where you always have to be authentified by the other to show that you are the real Black, or are you closer to white people. This is always the way people are judging you. And also I have an experience of race that is rooted in Europe, not in America, even if I lived there, it was too short to be a real experience. But I also have this experience from my belonging to the African continent, where I am not considered as a Black person. So that's why I wanted to keep this idea of hospitality, just because it is not rooted in a very heavy ontology and in the very massive idea of the being. And this is this floating idea, political idea of hospitality that helps me to be able to reconnect with all those difficult and contradictory experiences of Blackness. And as you said it, I don't know if I can reconnect that with your sentences in this way, but I think that the race is also a spatial experience. And sometimes you are not you are not Black or perhaps not white everywhere. And this I can say it in French, but in English it's quite difficult. This territorialization, I think it's the Deleuzian term.
Yeah, it's the same, territorialization. They just, translate it kind of literally for once. So that's an easy one.
Territorialization of race is very important because I really, this is the fact of I don't believe that, for example, being mixed race is the new expression of utopia. I really don't have an utopic investment of miscegenation or I don't know, hybridity or things like that. But what those experiences of hybridation or miscegenation gives us is the possibility not to reify Blackness into an ontology and to show the multiplicities of this concept, its difficulties through different spaces, through different histories. And to me, that's very important. That's why I was saying that this hospitality, this racial hospitality is a dream, because as you said, it can be ruined by the reality of some solidarities that are really rooted in this principle of race that is very sharp and difficult for people that are victims of racism, but are not recognized by the people who are fighting against racism. That's why I don't want to think an ontology of Blackness. I really don't want to think that. I want to think a kind of a different way to reconnect yourself to the question of race. And it is true. And it's perhaps, I know that many people think that Black people should escape from the question of Blackness, because when they consider themselves as Black, they are still victims. They are still defining themselves through the gaze of the one who wanted to destroy them. But I think that we cannot erase the fact that this idea of the skin, this idea, even in their biological sense, they took values to the people who were targeted. And I don't want to escape this value. And I don't want to erase the fact that Blackness became a value for many people and a way not only to fight, but also to dream and to create. And we cannot erase what has become a kind of even of a culture or many archives. And even if racism doesn't exist, I think that Black will still exist, just because we have this long history of beauty, of culture that was creating among those last centuries. So it was not really an answer to your question, but I just wanted to underline that I don't want to reflect or to draw or underline an ontology, and I would really be against the idea of I don't know how you say that, of constructing or theorizing an ontology of Blackness.
Thank you. No, you did, in fact, get to my questions, and that was very clear. I want to make sure we have time, and I'm sure Angael, you as well as moderator, want to make sure we have time for other people's questions.
I don't think there's that many questions. There are more reactions or comments. But I think Felwine had a second question, and I actually I would like to maybe contribute to the discussion, because when you mentioned the idea of a Black archive, I would have liked you to develop it a bit more. And if you were also, approaching the notion of archive in the Derridean sense and in all its connotation, if it was something you were thinking of, Yala. That was one question or one thing I would like maybe for you to develop. But the other thing, I kept thinking during your talk, being French and this necessity to have those discussions in the different spaces, but as well sometimes the fact that not only the terms of the debates are politically or philosophically different, but sometimes they might even feel untranslatable. I was thinking of Barbara Cassin, Le Dictionnaire des Intraduisibles, because for me, and I don't know if it's something that might resonate with your experience, but when I hear race or when I hear race, I don't hear the same thing. Because of the way in which the concept of race has been developed historically, philosophically in France, and with the connection with its colonial past. And also for me, it has one specific connotation. For those who are non-French specialists, I think that might be a minority here, but for people who are French or are, French specialists, that in France, we do not use ethnic statistics, for instance, and that the big trauma behind this political choice not to use statistics, which might help, in fact, in resolving questions of structural racism, is because the last time it was used, it was by Vichy, and it was used in a very zealous manner by the Vichy government to deportate the Jews, which were constructed as a race. And that's something which is always in a way underscoring my own understanding of race when I hear it. And I think it's something which is in fact quite common in France. And so I just was thinking, and it's more about opening the conversation on this idea of the spaces of the conversation, but as well the concepts in themselves and their resonances within those spaces. I don't know if I'm being very clear, but
yeah, it's very clear. But I think it's interesting because, for example, when I talk about Blackness as a French, I'm not sure that I talk about race. And it's true that it's but it's true that I don't know. I don't say that I de-racialized Blackness, but I'm not sure if I talk about race. That's really, that's. But to me, these are those questions. I can perhaps it's too. I would love to have clear answers, but I really don't have clear answers because the meditation is really hard, and that's why I really want to say that we are. Blackness is also a text, not because I am a postmodern person, even if I love, of course, postmodern thinkers, and especially French philosophers from the 70s, but just because those questions belongs to a long to a long history of thought that has dealt with those problems of identities, of race, of non-racial Blackness, and what are we in this mass of in these documents. And this, I think that those questions are, I have many. So you can see my confusion in the way I answer, but there are many paths, I think, when you try to understand those questions from France. First, I will be very Glissantian. There are many Frances. There is the France that is really connected to the history of that was created by the history of slave trade. And there is the Black France that is connected to the history of the colonization of Africa and immigration. And those two Frances, I mean, those two Black Frances who are connected in the fights, they don't bring with themselves the same memories of Africa, and they don't bring with themselves the same history and perhaps the same understanding of what is racism, perhaps, and what is Blackness also. Because you have histories of miscegenation in the Martinique or Guadeloupe that is completely not the same than in Africa or in France itself. And I think we have to reconnect with all those different paths. And I want to quote, not to quote, but to talk about an idea of Glissant between I don't know how you say, yeah, the abyss. He has this idea that the Atlantic Ocean is an abyss where Africa was destroyed, where the languages were destroyed, where the people, the filiation, the families were destroyed. And the history of the slave trade is this history of the abyss. And this history of the abyss has nothing to do with the history of the Black diaspora that is coming from Africa to Europe, because those people from perhaps Africa living in Europe, they don't have lost their names. They don't have lost their territories, the names of their territories. They don't have lost the history of their own families. And you have here two experiences of Blackness that are dealing with two different experiences of history, different experiences of memory, and different relations to the continent Africa. And what is interesting, I think, with the idea of perhaps racial hospitality is that it allows us to accept this difference into Blackness itself. And by the way, the difference we can face when we talk about race, perhaps in France and also in America. And I think that some of the, I don't know, I think that, for example, I was reading my text at the beginning and I was just thinking that I believe that the universal is a good answer to fight against racism. I still believe in that. But I still believe that.
But sometimes it's maybe because I think I'm too French, but yeah, I share this.
But sometimes I think, yeah, but sometimes I think that the condition to claim the utopian possibilities or virtualities of the universal is the affirmation of your Blackness and of race. And if you see Césaire, if you see Senghor, what did they do? They just reconstructed the idea of the universalism and the possibility of a large human community by posing the fact that they were Black subjects. And the position of being a Black subjects is now the condition that helps you to reconnect with those great ideals of possibility to make communities with other people. And I think that what is interesting, even in the when you see people fighting against race, is that when you consider race as a shelter, it's just because you don't want to be confronted to racism. Is that you don't want to be confronted to the fact of race. And this is also the aporia of racial hospitality. I don't know if it's clear, but let me give you another example. I still take my example of when I was a teenager in those Afrocentric French group, why we were all gathering together as Black people just to not be Black people anymore. But it was only possible inside a group of Black people. And this is an aporia. And this is exactly what it deals with racial hospitality. The only possibility of being a human is to be among the people who are sharing the same experiences of violence as you. And this is the idea of racial hospitality also, where you want to escape from the violence. The best way to live far from it is to live with the people who have suffered from it.
I think it's very clear and a very engaging concept you're putting. But maybe Felwine would like to ask a second question. And there are, in fact, now questions from the participants. So, Felwine.
Okay, thank you, Angel. It's a comment question. I think there is probably a way to escape the aporia that you raise by fighting a reified category by using the same category. Fighting racism by using the race as a shelter for all the reasons you explained. The same idea of Derrida, hospitality, this complicated word. The root of the word xenophobia is a xenos in Greek, and xenos has the same root than xenia, that is the root of hospitality. And here, probably hospitality is the relation, is a mode of knowledge. If you see it as a mode of knowledge that reduces the otherness, that brings what is distant more closer. It's why people that had the same experience want to be together to reduce their otherness by sharing their experience. So the other is made clothed by the one who welcome it. The hospitality made clothed and avoid this idea of infinity otherness that is in the idea of the foreigner. So to reduce the strangeness by a mode of relation, by a mode of knowing. If you think that this hospitality, why can't we move from the domestic hospitality, the one who is rooted in the culture, in the ethical propositions, in the group that you build, to a kind of cosmopolitic or public hospitality? So you get the hospitality out of this domesticity, and probably there is a space here to build a cosmopolitic hospitality. And I know that it's not easy, but if this space can be built, so probably we can escape the idea of race there, but it's an utopian proposition.
I don't know if I understood, but this paper has, I think, racial hospitality has nothing to do with cosmopolitanism, and it has nothing to do with political ideal. It is really infra-political, and it can nurture many different political ideals you want. Those of Black nationalism, for example, or those of great universalism. But the only idea of racial hospitality is that when you are victim of certain systemic violence from the society, you may believe that the ones who are victims of the same violence as you are the ones who are going to be able to welcome you, because they will understand. And that's how the question of race here can be interesting, is that, for example, you just believe that the people who are facing racism as you are able to be the ones who will welcome you, because they will spontaneously understand what you think. And that's why sometimes we gather as Black people, or sometimes we gather as Black people to fight for cosmopolitanism. That's what did perhaps people like Césaire and Senghor. From their negritude, they tried to build a kind of utopia of a common world with of a humanity. But from racial hospitality, you can also say, and being very Garveyan, and just say that we know how to find, now we found this shelter in race. We are gathering as Black people suffering from racism, and now we have to realize this shelter in a concrete land, in Africa, for example. And this dream of Garvey has nothing to do with the dream of Senghor or Césaire, for example, but I think that they are all rooted in this idea that race that is structures of violence, can become also a shelter for those who want to escape and find a land of race and a land of refuge. That's what I wanted to say. It's not a political idea.
No, it's clear, but I think my use of cosmopolitic is not understood. It's not cosmopolitan. You know, I know people who experienced the genocides of Tutsi in Rwanda. They went to Armenia and they built links with them because they have a shared experience of being a victim of genocides. And the relation here was a way of making the experience of the people of Armenia and the people of Rwanda closer, because they share the same experience, and they went beyond the idea of we are Tutsi, we understand, or we are Armenian. They have a shared experience. So it's this idea of a cosmopolitic of hospitality, building a relation that make what is strange, what is not understood by the other, understandable. So how can we deal in the space of the society to make my experience of Blackness, your experience of Blackness, to someone who is not Black, understandable, and make it closer? And probably we can broaden here the space of the community that shelter, if we can build this kind of mode of knowledge that made the distant experience closer, even if I don't share the same race. It's, you know, it's this idea, how can I do it? How can I feel closer, even if I don't experience it every day? And this mode of relation will do it.
But I understand, but I think that the question you raised, I have many things to say. It would be easier in French, but I will try in English. But the thing is that I have the impression in France that the more people are affirming and defending, who they are, the more people are able to hear them. And I think that it's terrible, because I think because it can also gives a lot of strength to people who want to say these people are too loud, now we have to throw them back to society. But I have the impression that if you don't express your experience collectively, you will never be heard. And I think that now the expressions of Blackness you find in France, I think they are heard. People want them to not to exist, but people now can hear, not that there is a Black problem in France, it has nothing to do with that, but that there are Black voices that are participating to the building of this country, that are criticizing this country, and are also producing beauty from the affirmation of their Blackness. And I don't think that, I think sometimes that when you show who you are, not as a stone, of course, not as an essence, but what are the problems you are dealing with, is the best way to give them publicity in the society, and also to make them shareable by the other. I don't know if it's clear or not.
Okay.
And I don't believe that difference, the expression, that's really not French in this case, but I don't believe that the expressions of differences are expressions of separations. I really don't believe that. And this is how now the French discourse, political discourses are now infusing the society. They just say that expressing your difference is expressing a way to separate from the other and to refuse the possibility to share your experience with other person than yourself. And what the people who are talking about who they are not just saying we are identified in this way and we don't want to be a part of. They just say we want to be a part of, and this is what we have to bring to this society. This is more a kind of contribution than a separatism or a will to separation. So I don't believe that to talk about, it's not narcissistic at all, but I don't believe that difference is not all the time an expression of a murderous separation. And this is really, I think, the difficulty that France has to deal with, because this country has a real problem with the concept of difference, which is a very important concept that was theorized and studied by many philosophers in the 20th century, from Sartre to Levinas and others, and Derrida, of course, but we really have a problem with this idea of difference.
And that's why your talk was very important, because that's so good to be able to get out of just a very terrible and binary discourse. Mm-hmm. That at times it feels that the political mediatic discourse, you can't escape those binary oppositions. That's just so tiring.
Yeah,
and that as well.
Yeah, sorry, Angela, but it's true. And I think that what is very difficult now, and I think the theory can help us for that, is to be able to underline in a very clear way the kind of contradictions we are in, and the kind of difficulties of aporias we are to deal with, and of course the way that the contradictions are pushed in the public space is very stupid. And I saw somebody quote the Balibar here, but Balibar always said that the problem is never between a particular and universal. It's between several conceptions of universalism. And it's very hard when you are in a country where the contradictions are so massive and so brutal to be able to just think about all the difficulties you face with the question of violence, discriminations, social justice, and things like that. Of course, the question of race.
Completely agree. I mean, you have two questions from the chat, and I think we will have to end soon, because there are 26 of us right now. So Laurent Mattori asks, I do have a question. Is there a similar contradiction between universalism and national citizenship? Another social construct that is used both to defend the equal rights of the citizen of that nation and to subordinate the rights of foreigners, and ignore the uneven access of citizens to the resources and the protections of the state. And that's one that was answered partially with a reference to Balibar, but I think it would be important if you take that question. And then there is another one too.
Yeah, I'm trying to read it at the same time. Sorry, I just need a little time.
You can see it.
Yeah, I'm reading it. Yeah, I think I don't know if its contradiction is at the core of my lecture, but I think that what Balibar said between the contradiction between this universalism and national citizenship is also, I mean, a contradiction that you can find in Hannah Arendt text about the question of it is in the text of imperialism when she do the I don't know, the tension between human rights and the reality of the national citizenship that give I don't know, that give solidity to these empty universalism, but by giving I don't know, solidity to the empty universalism, it excludes the others. And I think we still have, I don't know if it was the core of your question, but I think that this contradiction is not really at the core of my paper, because the people I am talking of are all citizenship of the French country. So I was not dealing especially with this contradiction of refugees or people or foreigners that are not French, but I was dealing with the problem of law of a kind of universalism and the way not all the people of the countries are treated in the same ways. And so the question is about the citizenship, but not about the foreigners. I don't know if I am clear, but the Black French I am talking about are all citizens of this nation that is France. But I think I don't know if I could really answer to your question. I don't know if you are still here, but
yes, I'm still here. I'm still here.
Yeah.
Yes, I know you were addressing the relationship of citizen to citizen, but I wonder if you're agonizing about what I think is an aporia, which I take to be a contradiction, an irresolvable contradiction. But I wonder if you similarly agonize about the contradiction between citizenship and universalism, and whether the skepticism about race as a form of identity is fair if we're not equally skeptical about national citizenship as a form of identity and sanctuary.
Yeah, it's true. I think it's true. Yeah. And I think that no, I think that it's a kind of no, it's true, of course. And it's a way to understand the kind of double standards of citizenship, and the question of race only deals with that. And of course, it's not, these are all citizens, but these are still these double standards that are here. And if you want to understand them, and if you want to understand why universalism remains a kind, sometimes really so empty, the question of race becomes here very, comes at the center of the explanation of it. So I understand more your question now. But it's very hard also, you know, to talk about double standards of citizenships, because and this is a very interesting debate in France. For example, I don't use the term, we have racisme d'État. I don't know, have you state racism, you call that in, I don't use it because we don't have law against Arab people. I mean, perhaps it's changing now with what is happening, but I don't know. But we don't have negative law against Black people, against Arab people, or things like that. So how can you explain, and this is the difficulty we have, and I remember a talk of Angela Davis also talking about this difficulty we have in France, but how can we talk about the question of systematic racism, or this idea that there is a double standard citizenship in this country? And for example, you have a lot of fighters that are not only anti-racist movements, but people who are fighting against the police brutality, trying to show that this police brutality targets especially non-white people, that is to say, people that are perceived as Arab or Black. And it's very hard to say there are double standard citizenship in a country that says that we are all equal. And the law doesn't say that you have to discriminate, because the law is here to protect you from discrimination. So how do you explain that what you are living, that this kind of brutalities that are facing some French citizen are rooted in race, when you are in a country where the law has been built to fight against racism itself? people will say that you are just having fictions, or that you are bringing ideas from the other continent, from the US, and that you love them so strongly that you want to bring them in France, or they will just say that you are believing in magical, I don't know, magical realities that do not exist. So that's why it's so difficult. And I think that the question and the tension you bring to us allow us to underline this difficulty.
I think in a way we go back to the question of, I mean, you would need the social sciences and you would need the fields. Yes. And that's why you need statistics, because statistics, well, certain use of statistic, an objective, if it could be at least trying to be objective use of statistic is necessary. And it's, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. And there is another question that is from, let me find, from William Reddy. Wonderful talk. Do you know of, agree with Ibrahim Kendi, how to be anti-racist, or I am Tigamine, different comme tout le monde?
No, I have to read Miriam Tigaminin. I don't know this reference. I will read it. I write it now. Can you say a little about it, William, if you are still here?
I think he's gone. I think he's gone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Too bad. Yeah, it's been more than 2 hours, so. But thank you so much for your talk. I mean, does anyone want to add something, or we might close the conversation?
No problem. Just a little thing as I want to add is that what Yala made clear here and made it very strongly is that acknowledging one's own lived experience and difference is not a way of desiring being out of the community, even if the community is always a fiction that is built. And this idea of being outside of the regions. So my singular experience based on race or racism and my desire to be part of the human community, the larger one, it's not a binary, idea. And what you were saying about how this debate is binarized in the space of media or in the intellectual space in France is absolutely true. And I think she shows the way of escaping this binarity.
And it's necessary, and it makes you feel good. Maybe we need that kind of tells that we need some utopia. Continue.
Yes, Afrotopia.
Some of utopia, Afrotopia, many utopias, different utopias.
No, I mean, we need utopias in France. That's true, because this is a country that really misses a kind of prophetical way to address to political problems or things like that. So I think we need more utopia in France. That's true. But I think in the US too, I don't know. You have a long history of repressed utopia in this country. And I really hope that, I don't know if that can be good news in the weeks that are coming, but I hope that you will have the less bad news you can have, really.
I think we are all crossing fingers and toes to have the less bad news, because it's been very hard for those last 4 years. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Yala Kisukidi. I think.
Thank you very much, and for the happy few that stayed until the end. And thank you for accepting my French English. And sometimes that is very confusing. And it was a pleasure to share this moment with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for forging ahead in English for those of us who have long wanted to hear you.